something about why I'm addressing the topic in the way I do by means of this gallop through. Can you all hear me? Oh. Is this better? Okay. 10 novels in each lecture. I did not want to stand here and generalize about African literature. In the first place, it does not work. It is too diverse a body. And in any case, what I am addressing is only contemporary writing in English or in English translation. Taking contemporary over a span of about 50 years, as you will have noticed. I did want to give you a sense of the diversity of the writing, diversity in topic, diversity in style, and every one of today's books originates from a different country. So I wanted to range over the entire continent to give a sense of the richness of its writing and also some sense of the individuality of these texts. They are not my 10 or my 20 best, but they are 20 of my personal favorites amongst African texts in the contemporary output in English or available in English translation. I don't use PowerPoint, but I brought you copies of the books. This is Arrow of God in the original Heinemann cover. Now, even people who know nothing about contemporary African writer have probably heard at least of Things Fall Apart. I did not want to start with that, although it in a sense initiated the present output of African writing in English and in other languages, but because it is probably Achebe's greatest novel. He had only 5. And it's pretty clear that he says it's a novel he's most likely to be found sitting down to reread. I think that I need to tell you something about what he himself said he was doing with this particular novel, which takes a period very slightly later than the first incursion of British colonialism, and the main figure of whom is the priest of his clans, his Ibu clan's main unifying god, a man known as Izulu, which is actually Eze Ulu, the priest of Ulu, the god. Okay. Achebe said that because of the humiliation and the defeat that colonialism inflicted on African societies like his own Ibu people, African people, like himself, had to do a battle of the mind with colonialism, and that there was the responsibility to create what he calls a new fable. What this new fable emphasizes is not that colonialism brought many useful things to the continent. What it does emphasize is that there was African participation of a crucial kind in the process, that it was not merely something inflicted, but something in which Africans played a role in being inventive, courageous, and responsibly creative in somehow absorbing and melding the incoming and the indigenous culture. Okay, now Izulu faces all kinds of conflict in the text, but he is a man who participates in all the conflicts with tremendous gusto. He is a tremendously impressive leader, but there are rivals for his leadership. In his clan, as Achebe emphasizes, it is being well spoken that is one of the most important things. So the arts of persuasion are very important in his clan. But the book opens when his eloquence has been defeated, and he feels humiliated by this and angry and resentful. Shortly afterwards, he is summoned by the district officer in his area, the British colonial district officer, to take on the role of a local leader, because the British are starting the process or the method of what they called indirect rule, where they appoint local leaders through whom they administer their own rule. Okay. But he sends back the message that he is nobody's priest but Ulu. Now the colonial officer is furious at this arrogant priest rejecting the summons, and he actually sends people to arrest Izulu. But Izulu, who feels angry at his clan's rejection, with the accusation that he is collaborating with the British, decides to go to Government Hill himself. And there he is persuaded that he is a guest and doesn't realize that he is a prisoner. However, he is the timekeeper of the clan. And he looks always at the new moon, and this is crucial because he has to announce the harvest. The harvest cannot take place unless the god Ulu sanctifies it through Izulu's announcement. But he's kept back from those announcements of new moons by 2 months. So when the time to harvest comes, Izulu will not announce the harvest. He calls himself an arrow of God, saying it's not his decision, he has to obey his priestly function. What happens then is that the clan has to find ways to allow them to harvest. And this facilitates the Christianization of a number of members of each family. And the Christians say, you may harvest in the name of the Christian God. And so Izulu, through standing fast in his own culture and trying to fend off both his enemies within and the colonial enemies, actually facilitates the change over to a new system, to colonial modernity, and to the acceptance, gradual initially, of not only Christianity, but also the arts of writing and all the technologies that accompany. So the subject is, if you like, how modernity came to Africa in a way that was violent and that violated much that was present in the clan. But also, Achebe demonstrates that Africans participated, and some of them were brave enough to say, let us find out what this is like, let us embrace it and try to make use of it for our own people. Because Nigeria is not a Western country, even after all these years, even after colonization and decolonization and new colonialism, whatever you like to call it, and capitalism, but it remains a Nigerian African country. Now, I turn to a very, very different kind of text with a cheeky title, Beer in the Snooker Club. This author, Wagui Gali, is an Egyptian, or was. He died by suicide, and Beer in the Snooker Club was his only novel. The main character lives a life very similar to Ghali's own. He is educated and intellectual, a member of very influential and very wealthy Egyptian families, but he is completely at odds with them, and he is personally penniless and lives as a kind of parasite, but is a constant satirical presence in his society. This is what the cover looks like. Beer in the Snooker Club, with the rather despondent face of Ram or Ramos, the main character. Ram is profoundly in love with a Jewish woman. Now remember, the setting is the 1950s. The revolution and Nasser's power have happened. Nasser's coming to power. But it's also the time when Israel has been founded, and profound tension and political anxiety. It's also the time of the Suez Crisis. And not only does Ram's friend have to contend with the fact of being a Jewess, but also she is a communist. And President Nasser imprisons and tortures those suspected of being leftist, revolutionaries, contesting his kind of revolution. Ram is what one might call a kind of secret revolutionary, a secret activist. What we are shown in the text is that he takes photographs of people who are tortured and executed in Nasser's jail, and he attempts to send the knowledge and news of this out to the world. But it's very, very dangerous and risky undertaking. He is at the same time constantly at odds with his wealthy family. And although he is profoundly in love with this Jewish woman, she has secretly married a fellow Jewish activist years ago, and actually finally breaks up with Ram. When Ram laments the breakup between them, what he tells her is that although she has charged him with not being truly Egyptian, it is she who is not, because she is so solemnly serious a revolutionary and activist. And he says, we would all have died long ago, all we Egyptians, if we had not had our humor. Because he is irreverent. And he is constantly mocking the pretensions of all kinds of Egyptians around him, most of whom he knows, of the ones that he knows, are very, very privileged people, wealthy, even if they abjure their parents' wealth, as his Jewish female friend, his beloved, does. The novel ends when he settles for marriage with a young Egyptian woman from another wealthy family. He has respect for her, although he's also critical of her, not being sufficiently critical of the Nasser regime. But he manages to remain a gadfly of some kind, and to show us some kind of triumph, some way of coping with the tensions of the time. It's a tremendously sophisticated, satirical text in the way that it examines African and specifically Egyptian wealth and political government. I turn next to a Somali novel. Although it was written in English, Nuruddin Farah, many of you may have heard of him. He has been resident in Cape Town. I'm not quite sure whether he still lives primarily in Cape Town, but he has lived in many parts of the world. He had to leave Somalia as a young man, and his way of fighting, he had to leave at the time of the tyrannical government of Siad Barre. Okay, Siad Barre was the dictator who was overthrown in the collapse of Somalia into mayhem, in the wake of which we have Al-Shabaab and all the other organizations. Now, this is the first novel in a trilogy a trilogy which Farah calls Variations on the Theme of an African Dictatorship. And it opens, its cover has this strange head of an obviously dead man wrapped enwrapped, and he is the twin brother of the main character in this text, and he dies at the very beginning. Again, a figure of revolution, but in this case, someone who was in government, but who explicitly uses the written word and written texts in order to record in this largely oral society what is happening and what forms of repression are occurring. This is at the time when Siad Barre has accepted Soviet aid in his country. And the main character mentions at one point that a friend of his has been arrested for anti-Soviet activities. This is in Somalia, in Africa. So he says, is this Russia? It is embarrassing what is happening in our country, as well as terrible. Now, the main character is an initially politically ignorant and timid person. He's a dentist in a country where hardly anybody's teeth need treatment. And slowly, because of his brother's death, by suspected poisoning by the political regime of Barre's time. So slowly, his brother starts investigating what is the nature of the society that could lead to the murder, the secret murder of a man like my brother. What is in some ways to him worse than the actual murder is the fact that the regime attempts to co-opt his brother's heroically resistant life by calling him a hero of the Somali Revolution. Now, the Somali Revolution is a bogus revolution because it has led to a very obvious dictatorship where people live in fear. And Farah himself wrote in one of his brilliant essays, it was a time when one could see fear spreading across people's faces like melted butter. People are not allowed to gather. People are not allowed to say anything, even vaguely critical. Neighbors report on neighbors. People disappear into jails without any kind of trial, without even any kind of record. And this is the context in which the main character finds himself, and in which he persists in pursuing his brother's murderers and the system that killed his brother, and in exposing it at great risk to himself. I turn now to a novel closer to our country, the Zimbabwean Harvest of Thorns. Harvest of Thorns was written by Shimmer Chinodwa. He was not himself a participant in the Zimbabwean War of Liberation, the Second Chimurenga, as it is locally known. And the novel is, as it were, in two generational halves. It is the generation of the main character's parents, who live submissive lives under British colonialism. And the mother of the main character is wonderfully described as country humble, as wearing her sneakers, as being being scout belted, and the kind of parochialism of that society is slowly supplanted with revolutionary anger. But Benjamin's parents had great problems conceiving a child. They joined a fundamentalist Christian group that is utterly conservative and determinedly and even anti-political. So when Benjamin, as a young man, is taunted with being a sellout, this places a tremendous burden of anxiety and anger on him and a desire to disprove this accusation. So, in secret, without telling his parents, when he's merely 17 years old, he goes and joins the Second Chimurenga, the freedom fighters of this time. And this description of participation in the war is completely, it's unheroic. There's no kind of heroization of the ugliness of war, of the boredom of war, of the loneliness and isolation, and of the tensions that develop amongst these young men, boys one might call them, who participate in the war and have to shoulder the huge responsibility. At one point, they discover that a village woman has reported their presence, they're a small military group, has reported their presence to the British, to the colonialists. And being exposed as a traitor, she has to be punished in public. And Benjamin, which is his real name, his nom de guerre, his war name, is Pasi Nema Sellout. Down with the sellouts. He has to be one of the two young men who has to beat this woman to death with big sticks. And he is horrified at this. And although he is angry with his mother for her constant disapproval and the restriction in which she tried to bring him up, he cannot help thinking that this woman that he has to beat to death on pain of being shot himself by his commander resembles his own mother. So in his mind, he composes letters to his mother saying, I didn't know it would be like this. So that's a de-glamorization of war that happens. Eventually, of course, the war is over. Benjamin returns home and he finds his mother embittered. His father has left her for another woman. But Benjamin's return, in a sense, inadvertently engineers a reunion. The title and the grimness of the title, Harvest of Thorns, emphasizes that there is no sense of the glory of victory in a free Zimbabwe for Benjamin, for the main character. There's only a sense of being let down. But he, during the war, saved a young woman's life. He and she became lovers, and she arrives at his home heavily pregnant, and soon thereafter gives birth to a little boy. And this is how Benjamin's feelings are described. He names the baby Zvenyika Klopos Tichafa. And Benjamin says to the baby and about the baby, Zvenyika will use his head and hands and grow up to be somebody, he says. He's only 20 and he has no job or house of his own yet, but he tells himself he'll do all he can to raise the little bundle of humanity in the cot. He'll do all he can, even though all he has is a pair of chapped hands. He tells himself he'll do it. There's a lovely description of the baby as he first sees it. a little hill of a nose, a pink line of pursed lips, and 2 brown leaves of ears. So there's a great deal of tenderness, even in a novel that evokes so much harshness. There's a great deal of humor also alleviating the grimness of the tension. And it is a kind of Bildungsroman over generations of how colonial Rhodesia becomes Zimbabwe, post-colonial Zimbabwe. I now turn to a very unusual text. It is by a Libyan Tuareg, Ibrahim Al-Koni, the author, as you can see on your list. He only learned to speak Arabic when he was 12 years old because he grew up as a nomad. And he became one of Arabophone Africa's greatest writers. And strangely, from dry, hot Libya, he went to Switzerland, where he lived most of his adult life. And the novel was translated from Arabic into English. It is a strange account, or strange, I think, to most of us because of its unusual nature, of a love relationship between a man and a camel. It's not a bestial relationship, it's not sexualized. It's a commitment, a profound commitment, a mutual commitment between the man. He's of aristocratic origin, but is disinherited by his father because he doesn't marry the young woman that would unite his father's clan, his father's a sheikh, with another clan. He instead marries a beautiful Moroccan woman. For that he is disinherited. But he has this camel, which he adores. When terrible drought overtakes him and his small family, by this time he has a son, his anxiety and anguish is not only at not being able to provide for his family, but not being able to provide for his camel. A rich cousin, a male cousin of the wife, arrives, gives them some food and so on. He comes back later. Eventually, he offers to take the camel in pawn for helping them financially and with food. And very reluctantly, the main character gives the camel in pawn to this other man, this wealthy man. But the camel constantly breaks free and constantly returns to the main character's home. It happens over and over again, although he honorably returns the camel because he can't yet redeem the aid that the family member provided. Eventually, this man says to him, "It is clear that your camel will persist in breaking away. I make you an offer. Divorce your wife so that I can marry her and you can have your camel back." And initially he's absolutely horrified, but as time passes, and of course his wife is angry with him for not being able to provide for herself and his son. What we also find out later is that the relative, the cousin, was a youthful love. The two cousins could not marry at the time. So he divorces his wife. The cousin, the rich man, adds a small bag of gold dust, which the main character rejects. His people have no value, have no sense of the value of gold. It doesn't matter to them. But the cousin insists and eventually accepts the gold dust. And that's what the title refers to, not to the desert sands. He then flees into exile, goes and lives in a cave far away with the camel. But eventually he finds out that he's notorious over the wide desert ranges of his own country and neighboring countries. His name is notorious as a man who sold his wife for a bag of gold dust and a camel. He is so angry that he decides to go and murder the wife's cousin, and he arrives on the eve of their marriage. And he kills him. And he pours the gold dust over him because he's never had any use for it. But now he has to flee into exile. The murdered man's relatives are in pursuit, and of course they eventually find him. And he dies ignominiously and brutally torn apart by 2 camels. It's a fascinating novel because it completely convincingly portrayed the relationship, the intensity of it, and all the travels they go through. It may be some kind of coded language for homosexuality or a homosexual relationship that is, of course, completely disallowed in a Muslim culture like theirs. But it may simply, and I think this is the most satisfactory way of taking it, a demonstration of the kind of intense bond that does from time to time, in most human cultures, develop between a human being and a creature. Okay. I moved to quite a small novel, A Cowrie of Hope. This author is from northern Zambia. And he has written another novel which I can't get hold of. He is known to be a widower. And I think the novel is in some way possibly a tribute to the wife that he lost, because as you can perhaps make out, the cover image shows 2 female figures. And the text concerns a very loving relationship between a very poor woman and her talented daughter. The daughter is quiet but comes top of her class and is about to she's of high school going age, and she is awarded a bursary to go to a school, but it will still cost the dirt poor mother money that she does not have. From her position, it's an astronomical amount. There's nothing. They live dirt poor lives. So the mother, the widowed mother, decides the only thing she can do is to go to the relatives of her deceased husband. She hates them, and they treated her abominably. Her husband, who was not exactly an ideal caring husband, but at least he left all that he owned in his will, but the relatives tore up the will and took everything, and this woman with her daughter had to flee back to her own village and live a hard scrabble life. But when she arrives at her deceased husband's brother's place, the homestead is deserted of all its livestock. The arrogant, philandering brother lies dying of AIDS. His first and second wives have already died of the same disease, and his third and last wife is about to succumb to the same illness. It is never referred to by name in the text. She calls it the disease of today. I want to give you a little bit of a sense of the texture of writing in this novel. The local language feeds into the kind of English phrasing that is employed in the text. The mother's name is Nasula because her daughter is Sula. So she's the mother of Sula, this African way of giving a mother the name, adapting the mother's name to her first child's name. Nasula is the one who refers to the disease of today, to which her brother-in-law has succumbed. So there's no help there. She returns disconsolately to her home and to her daughter, whom she keeps assuring she will find a way. And the daughter tells her, your friend who lives in the city is on a visit here. The friend is as poor as Nasula. She's the mother of many children, but she is a woman of tremendous spirit and enterprise. And she inspires Nasula with the idea that in this time of drought, a particular very special kind of bean, of which she has a couple of bags, harvested from her meager little field, will sell for a good sum of money in the capital. And the two women set off to the capital. Nasula refers to her friend's intrepid spirit as the woman of a woman. That's the kind of, that gives you a taste of the writing. Anyway, the section in the city is titled, What Powers of Darkness? Because unfortunately, being poor and unused by now to city ways, Nasula is cheated of her precious bags of beans by an unscrupulous city slicker. And in despair, she goes to her friend to be told that even she has no backup plan at this point. So she gets onto the bus. A kind stranger has lent her the money. This is the way her thoughts are described. Dangerous thoughts in the caverns of her being beat down upon her parched soul. But when she's only a little way out of the city, a whirlwind, this is another quotation, a whirlwind was born inside her, filling her with an unearthly power, a confusion of hate, love, and passion. She decides to get off the bus, manages to persuade the reluctant bus driver to refund most of the price of the bus ticket, returns to the city. She is going to track down the thief. She lives for several days on next to nothing. She is dirty. She sleeps at the bus station. She survives on so little food that she becomes skeletal. Eventually, she manages to spot the thief who arrives in his fancy sports car at the supermarket. And she hangs onto his car. He drives off with her hanging on, despite people's screams that he should stop. Then there's a policeman, a good policeman, who stops the car, who listens to Nasula's story and says, you both have to come with me to the police station. But of course, the officer on duty is corrupt. He knows the crook very well, and he lets him go. So again, Nasula, after all these ordeals, seems to face complete defeat. Then she spots a staircase going to the upper orders and the higher officers, and she finds the commander's office. And this is a good man who listens to her story, who knows the crook, who has been trying to find him, who has been suspecting the desk officer of corruption, and he believes Nasula. They track down the thief. He is arrested and he is forced to refund, to pay her the money and a considerable sum in damages. And triumphantly, she buys the clothes, the uniform, carrying the mattress on her head, all of which has to go with her daughter to the school. and the story ends on this triumphant note. It's very beautifully achieved, and with such empathy from a male author to this brave but very poor woman, and her enterprise and her refusal to give up or to give in. Okay, I move now to a book which I don't have here. I couldn't get hold of a copy, I'm sorry. It's perhaps the most famous novel, although that term is strange to use, but it's the best known account, novelistic account, fictional response to the Rwandan genocide of 1994. Murambi, the Book of Bones, was translated from the French, and the title reference, Murambi, is to one of the actual genocidal sites. It was a technical school where Tutsis in their thousands were lured after being told that they were French soldiers who would protect them. And although in the novel a higher number is given, factual accounts say that 45,000 Tutsis were slaughtered there. Okay. The horror of the Rwandan genocide has, perhaps strangely, this is a feature, of course, of African writing, and that's why I called my essay collection Dealing with Evils. African writers cannot ignore the many horrors of the continent, although they by no means suggest that it's unalleviated horror and that there is not life and hope and normality and reasons for humor and life enjoyment on the continent, but they cannot ignore the awful things that have happened. And so the Rwandan genocide has invited, as a way of somehow coming to terms, coming to understand the awfulness of this phenomenon. In fact, there was an undertaking to take 10 authors from different countries to Rwanda for, this was of course after the genocide, and so they were all from other countries, not from Rwanda, and several of those texts are very well worth reading and became well known, but the best known of them is this one. The author is Senegalese. He was an experienced novelist, a public intellectual, a lecturer in philosophy, and a journalist by the time he wrote this. But he undertook this task of writing about the genocide of people not his own with tremendous humility, with tremendous trepidation, understandably. And he testifies to that. What he does in the novel is to adopt the persona for the main character of a Rwandan who went into exile because there were a number, and this is one of the suggestions of why the genocide happened, that there were previous massacres, but that the perpetrators of those massacres were left unpunished. And so that in a sense, almost a tradition developed. Diop also contests, as many Africans do, the simple ascription of ethnic hatred. There is a greater concession to the idea of resented class difference. The colonists favored the Tutsis. And the colonists, in fact, although they all speak the same language and worship the same God, It was the colonists who insisted on identity cards identifying every Rwandan as either a Hutu or a Tutsi or Twa. That's the small group of so-called pygmies that are native to Rwanda. Now, when Cornelius, the main character, returns to Rwanda, it is long after the genocide. He was led to believe that his father, who was famous as a Hutu who married a Tutsi wife, is in fact not the war hero and the savior of Tutsis that he believed him to be, but that his father was the great traitor who led so many Tutsis, including Cornelius's siblings and his mother, to Murambi, knowing that they would all be massacred. So Cornelius has to deal with this, the horror of this shock, not only of the genocide, not only of the deaths of his mother and siblings, but of his own father being incriminated in the deepest sense, in the genocide itself. So the text indicates how he has to come to terms with this, and now he has to find a way of writing about it, because he intends to write a play. He has two friends from long ago who are still in Rwanda. One is a woman who masqueraded as a Hutu. She too was Tutsi, but she masqueraded as a Hutu in order to find out what was being planned, where the next massacre would happen. What Diop, the Senegalese author, suggests is also, he reports this in the course of the text, that although the French colonialists are not primarily blamed, there is a French military officer who says, we were the only people who could have stopped the massacre. Not only did they not do that, not do anything, but they in fact instructed the Hutu genocidaires, as they are known, how to proceed systematically, how to start from one street and to move through the streets in order to make the genocide efficient. In 100 days, almost 1 million people, mostly Tutus, also the moderate Hutus who stood against the massacre, and some of the Twa citizens, mostly slaughtered by hand, by machete. And the horror of it is the efficiency with which it was undertaken. And of course, as we all know, the Tutsis were dehumanized, they were labeled cockroaches. And killing them was a duty, and it was proclaimed by radio from the pulpits. And even French Catholics who were in the country participated on the side of the genocidaires, unfortunately. So many, many horrors are addressed here. But they are faced, and eventually the novel is colored by the main character's relationship with his uncle, who says to him, you have to survive and you cannot take the guilt of your father as your own. Remember that your mother gave birth to you when she was escaping an earlier massacre. You have to honor her by remaining alive and doing good work to heal our society. And we will not heal our society if we perpetuate the vengeance cycle. And he says that his brother's home has to become a refugee center for orphaned children of all ethnicities, all Rwandan ethnicities. And it's on that note that the novel concludes. We have little time left. I Speak to the Silent is a South African novel. The silence addressed here is the silence of primarily black South Africans. The main character, his daughter, becomes an activist. They live in Alice in the Eastern Cape, and his daughter flees into exile. In exile, she is raped, she is impregnated by the head of the refugee center, who is a great struggle hero. The daughter dies of a post-abortion infection, ignominiously, but there is a child from a previous marriage to a young man, a fellow activist who escaped into Lesotho to join the anti-apartheid struggle from there. And this child becomes the one to whom the author and the narrator dedicates a text. He says, it is for her that I have to write my daughter's story. But he says, what happened in our country happened because the young people, too young for the responsibility, had to shoulder the responsibility of speaking out and acting against the murderous system, the evil system of apartheid. And we, the parental generations, did not speak. So that's why the novel is called I Speak to the Silent. But the novel roundly condemns and addresses white South Africans. It's not as though, white South Africans are let off the hook in this text for their participation and their propping up of apartheid over the decades that it prevailed. Okay, here is War Child, a boy soldier's story, and I wanted to include it because I think it is one of the best of the African memoirs of a child soldier. Emmanuel Yell is nowadays internationally known as a singer. His first novel was War Child, because as a boy, his father's Dinka, his mother was part Dinka, part Nuer, and they were, of course, under the domination, the brutal, violent, murderous domination of Arab Sudanese. Villages invaded and murdered for livestock, for harvests, and of course for the oil fields. So gradually war seeps into the boy's life, into the happy life of this family. What is interesting is that his mother is the great inspiration in his life. It is his father who is a commander in the Sudanese Liberation People's Army, SPLA, who orders the boy when he's 7 or 8 to join the caravan of boys who walk from Sudan into Ethiopia to a refugee camp where they are promised education. When they arrive there at the camp, after many thousands of boys have died en route, they find only starvation. It's very, very slowly that the international NGOs begin to supply food and later on education. But then he's swallowed up in the war, and the boy develops, in a sense, almost to supplant his anguish at the loss of his mother, who dies early on in some kind of explosion. He never knows exactly how. So he supplants the anguish at the losses he has had to experience by a burning hatred against Arabs. He makes no distinction. He's a boy. and he participates as an actual soldier in uniform and under command, and yell painful